Personal explanations. Obituary and other ceremonial speeches.
None.
Raising of matter of privileges.
None.
Government business. Bills. First readings. The Youth Justice Amendment Bill 2018.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I read it, so we just have to say it's been read the first time. Sorry? You don't call me. Okay, we get a second reading. How sure we're doing youth justice bill?
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
The Trade and Business Licensing Amendment Bill 2018. It's been set down. It's been read first time.
It's been read the first time.
And I know what you need. I know you need. I know what you need. I'll get it to you.
For a second reading. Who is doing it?
Second readings. The Youth Justice Amendment Bill 2018.
Honorable AG.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill entitled A Bill for a Law to Amend the Youth Justice Law 2005 revision to make provision for the application of cautions to persons under the age of 18 and to remove references to Her Majesty's pleasure in conformity with the Constitution and for incidental and connected purposes.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the mover wish to speak thereto?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Very briefly. Mr. Speaker, members will recall that this Legislative Assembly enacted the Cautions Adult Law 2017, early last year, last year. That law, Mr. Speaker, sought to introduce the use of cautions for adults, as previously cautions were only available to young persons under the Youth Justice Law. It has, however, been brought to our attention that a lacuna exists with respect to cautions for persons between the age of 17 years and 18 years under the Cautions Adult Law. And that is so, Mr. Speaker, because the Cautions Law, Adult Law, is applicable to adults, that is, persons over the age of 18 years, whereas the Youth Justice Law is only applicable to persons under the age of 17 by virtue of the definition of young persons in the Youth Justice Law. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, this amendment is being sought to the Youth Justice Law to basically close that lacuna, and so that persons between the ages of 17 years and 18 years would also be eligible to be cautioned, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the second section, second clause, or the second matter to be dealt with, is that some time ago, the Court of Appeal, in a judgment case, Hydes against the Queen, pointed out the need for an amendment to the Youth Justice Law to bring that law into conformity with the Constitution as it relates to the principles are the doctrine of separation of powers, that is executive versus judiciary in this instance. Mr. Speaker, in the case of Hydes and the Queen, the appellant was a young man, young person, and was convicted and was ordered to be detained until the pleasure of His Excellency the Governor be known. He brought an appeal on the basis that the sentence offended the constitutional doctrine of separation of powers, because the power to determine the length of his sentence was inherently a judicial function and was vested in the executive arm of government rather than the judiciary. The Court of Appeal, Mr. Speaker, accepted the submission at the time and ordered that it be changed from the governor's pleasure to detention at the court's pleasure. And so, in order to give effect, well, the Court of Appeal also recommended that the law should be amended to reflect that change, that persons detained, young persons so detained should be detained at the court's pleasure rather than at the governor's pleasure, and thereby, giving effect to the doctrine of the separation of powers, where matters such as the length of a sentence is determined by the judiciary and not by the executive. And so, Mr. Speaker, the bill also addressed that issue as it relates to Clause 3. Mr. Speaker, I must mention that there's some minor adjustments to be made to this bill, and I've sent around a committee stage amendment which would deal with some of the issues, minor issues in this bill by way of a sort of tidying up exercise. But, Mr. Speaker, that's the purpose of this very short bill, and I certainly commend it to members of this House.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member from East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whilst this side of the House recognizes the need to remove these lacunas out of our laws, there are a few things that I would like to encourage the government to look at. Mr. Speaker, the youth justice law came into being in 1995. This is the first amendment thereto. It was revised in 2005. Don't know why it was revised, since there wasn't any amendments made to it. But be that as it may, Mr. Speaker, this morning the Premier, in his statement on crime, said that improving policing only deals with crime now, and that in the longer term, the answer lies in stopping our people turning to crime in the first place. And he believed that the most significant contribution to long-term crime reduction, besides good education, will come with the early identification of young people at risk of offending behavior. And I believe, and he went on to say that implementing programs to help them help them make better life choices choices that will benefit them, their families, and their communities. I think everybody can agree with that statement. I think we all believe that to some extent, crime starts from criminals are born from an early age in many instances. And if we do not capture them, we will find our hands full in later times. Mr. Speaker, I think Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleagues for having me there. Yolanda Ford report in 2006, I think it was, or 7, spoke about that as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, I said all that to say that in this youth justice law, there are so many things that does not coincide or align or dovetail with what the Premier said this morning and Yolanda Ford and what we all think about of trying to help the youth. And it may be time for us to review this law and make the necessary changes to dovetail our hopes or wishes or dreams or ideals for the youth of this country to make them better citizens. Mr. Speaker, the youth justice law the adult cautions seems to mirror the youth justice caution provision. Section 28. Wherein it talks about the same thing, about when cautions are issued to people under 17, young people, which is the definition of a young person is under 17. In Section 2, a young person means subject to the provision relating to youth rehabilitation orders a person under the age of 17. So I don't know if we're not going by changing it now to 18 that the caution is related to. Then how that dovetails into under 17. And the Attorney General, when he responds, can make us know that. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we are to follow our ideals and our dreams, there's so many places in this youth justice law where it just doesn't apply, in my view, such as the joint charging of youth under 17, wherein if it's someone else that committed that crime over 17, that they can be committed, both can be committed to, in some instances, summary court, not the youth justice court, which comprise of magistrate and justice of the peace, but can even go up to grand court. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't propose that that is totally unjust or should not happen in some cases like murder and the likes. But the discretion under the youth justice law seems to be left up to the magistrate. For instance, assignment of charges to courts. (5.2) A charge with respect to a summary offense made jointly against a young person or the person who has attained the age of 17 years shall be heard by a court of summary jurisdiction other than a youth court. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I'm trying to impress upon the government is if we are to assist our youth and get them to be productive citizens, we need to look at different ways of finding them, our youth, in contravention of the law and how we treat them eventually and to get to that stage of punishment. Because there are many things that I am not saying the country needs to turn a blind eye, but I am saying that there needs to be a lighter hand to give these youth, the youth of this country, the opportunity to mend their ways. For instance, the caution adult law specifically says that and Mr. Speaker, reading from section 10 of the Caution Adults Law 2017, 10.1. Where a person has been administered a caution in relation to an offense, upon the expiration of 3 years from the date of the administering of that caution, that person's caution recorded in relation to that offense shall be treated as expunged. Now, Mr. Speaker, the reverse of that is true in the youth justice law. And Mr. Speaker, I thought that this law in 1995 was long before its time, really, because it represented things that we have only just put in place for adults, which is cautions. Subsection 5 of the 28 of the Youth Justice Law 2005 revision says, if a young person who has received a caution is convicted of an offense, the caution statement signed by the young person shall be produced to the court that convicted the young person, that court may take his previous behavior as described in the statement into account when sentencing him for the offense. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a child who is 14 who commits an offense. He is cautioned. When he reaches just under 18, there is another offense. that caution is considered when sentencing for that offense, the current offense. Whereas an adult who was cautioned in their 30s, 20s, whatever they want to be in, 3 years later, it's expunged and they commit an offense. And we all know how the conviction, we did that recently, I believe, in this year. Spent conviction is, which specifically says one cannot be asked about their expunged record. Now, Mr. Speaker, these are the things that are, in my view, are going to confuse our youth. If we can, we need to make it as easy as possible for these young people to catch back up. Because we're not talking about young adults. We're talking about young children. That's who we're talking about. Kids may, Mr. Speaker, God forbid, we had been charged for all our misdeeds. For instance, Mr. Speaker, how many times have we not, well, deliberately or not, but in this case it would be deliberate, broken somebody's windows? And it is considered malicious damage to property. In this case, that kid, 12, could have been cautioned for that. But even if that youth becomes an adult, that can be used against them. Because it doesn't say that it gets expunged when he reaches 18 even. That's the kind of stuff I would like to see. I believe that's the kind of stuff this side would like to see, and I'm sure there are members on that side who would agree that that may very well be a lacuna as well. So I believe that somehow we need, I'm not saying do not or condone the behavior, the bad behavior of everyone in the country. But we must also consider that there are times when youth get themselves into things that are not necessarily in keeping with societal norms. And if given the opportunity, they can be rehabilitated. I know the youth justice law makes provision to not impose or record convictions. I know that's all available in this law. But in the same token, I think it's time we took a comprehensive view of this law. For instance, Mr. Speaker, we had For instance, Mr. Speaker, we had Eagle House. When we developed Eagle House, I stood on this floor and objected to it. That was one, the premier said, my cousin, that's true. But now we got another cousin doing another thing. Mr. Speaker, it is difficult for us to give our kids a chance. I was talking recently to someone who was relaying to me that the recent crime where we had one of those individuals had been in prison from young, and they enjoyed a particular activity program that the prison had set up to try to rehabilitate them. And it was dealing with animals. As a young kid, youth under the age of 18, 17. And as soon as we changed director at the prison, they cut that program out. And that young adult, youth, rebelled against just that one action by the prison. Therein lies our biggest problem in this country. If there is no follow-through, we're going to get ourselves involved in more problems. And there is no follow-through in this country, Mr. Speaker, or very little follow-through in this country when it comes to the youth. I've known of justices of the peace relating to me how they sit in the justice court and the parents don't even come. But the youth justice law gives them warrant authority to bring the parents in front of them. And nobody follows through. How do we do it? I don't know, Mr. Speaker, the total answers to that. But if the Premier and the government recognizes that there is a problem within the youth that could manifest itself even worse in years to come, then I believe we all need to put our heads together and see how we can comprehensively look at this thing and come up with something that is reasonable to help our youth. This caution thing is not the full answer. It is not the complete answer. We continue to legislate all our lives with black and white that we hope will get people walking the straight and narrow way. The minister said so this morning to me. Under the custom law, it is put in there to deter. That's not the answer. The answer, when I do not know the complete answer, the answer must, I believe, include follow through. Provisions that the youth will see that we care, that we're not out to convict all the time. Just Monday, these hallowed halls were filled with youth. In this age bracket, Mr. Speaker, we celebrate it. It is but a fraction of what we have to deal with. We don't have to worry about those. I believe I have contributed more to the youth parliament in this country than any other legislator. I've traveled with more than any other legislator. And what makes me proud is that when I see them on the street, they have all become successful. The two before last that the clerk and I went to BVI with, one is doing medicine in Jamaica, and the other one is doing medicine in St. Lucia. The last two in Bahamas that the member from Newlands and I and the Minister for Works went with. They're both doing their A-levels and studying law and accounting together. They're doing 5 A-levels. Well, they tried to do 5, they cut them down to 3 or something like that. And attending law school and haven't even left school yet. We don't have to worry about those. The only thing we need to worry about those with is pushing them. The others, we need to start holding them back. And that's what we need to do. The family services unit in this country is overwhelmed with it. What can they do? In the absence of specific legislation which is comprehensive, they all get cautions. I'm not saying that what the Attorney General has brought here, Mr. Speaker, is wrong. My plea, my appeal is to the government, whilst we celebrate Monday, let us stretch the hand that the member from South Sound chaired, and we all supported on Monday. Let us stretch that even wider. Let's cast that net a little wider. That's where we can do it, Mr. Speaker. Not only we can do it, we have a moral responsibility to do it. We tend too much to stay within our comfort zones. And if our children are okay, and our families are okay, then it's okay. Well,
You are still on the bill, Honorable Member?
what are you trying to do? Tell me to stop?
No, I'm not trying to tell you to stop at this point, but I think you're stretching some points.
Well, I have seen stretch.
Honorable Member, let's not go there.
No, but
No, don't worry about the.
You need
you've
to tell
seen.
me what you want me to
Honorable
do.
Member, don't worry about what you've seen. What you see is the bill before you. Carry on.
well, the stretch is stretch. And you need to tell me what is required of me. Because it's the same discussion I'm having about caution and youth. Now you tell me what you want.
I am asking you to keep strictly to the bill, that's all.
Mr. Speaker, I understand. Be careful what? I have a right to defend and advocate for the people of this country in these hallowed halls, and in general and particular the people of East End. And I cannot be curtailed. Okay?
Honorable member, take your seat, please. I am not trying to curtail you, but I do believe that you are stretching it when you could say, and don't even let me go there to try to tell you how, but I think be careful that you are not going overboard with it.
Mr. Speaker, this amendment affects this entire bill, this entire law that it tries to amend. And it's about the youth, and it's about cautioning the youth. It's about convicting the youth. That's what that one word talks about. Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of this section, young person means a person under the age of 18. That is amending section 28. Now let's look at section 28 of the youth law. Do I need to read the whole thing? Or nobody read it? Should keep in mind that it's quite lengthy. Subject to subsection 5, where a young person admits to the police to having behavior in a manner that amounts to an offense. He may be cautioned in accordance with this section instead of being charged and tried for the offense. An offense of breaking windows, of doing this, of doing that. 2, for the purposes of subsection 1, a caution shall take the form of a written statement. That is, A, read to your young person by a uniform, read to the young person by a uniformed branch of the police force of the rank of inspector of bow in the presence of a parent, guardian, or other person having parental responsibility for him, and B, then signed by the young person, the police officer, and the parent, guardian, or other person having parental responsibility for the young person. 3, the statement shall contain A, details of the behavior to which the young person admits. B, details of the offense constituted by that behavior. C, a warning of the young person not to behave in that manner again. D, a warning to the young person that if, while still a young person, he is convicted of any offense, the caution will be revealed to the court that convicts the young person and may be taken into account by that court when sentencing the young person for the offense. And C, an acknowledgement by the young person, 1, that he acted in the manner specified in the statement, and 2, that he has been made aware of the results of being convicted of any subsequent offense while still a young person. 4, the original statement shall be retained by the police and a copy shall be retained by the young person. 5, if a young person who has received the caution is convicted of an offense, the caution statement signed by the young person shall be produced to the court that convicted the young person, and the court may take his previous behavior, as described in the statement, into account when sentencing him for the offense. It is so important that they're repeating it twice. to put him in jail. And you got to tell me I can't talk about it? No joking.
Please do not impute any improper motive to this chair. I've warned you several times about it. You have every right to speak, but you don't have any right to impute wrongdoing to this chair or to any minister or any member of this House or of the government unless you have proof. Simply debating doesn't mean that you understand it and we don't, because you're absolutely wrong there. We do. We have the same concerns you have, but don't impute improper motive. And you've done it.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not imputing any improper motives. I'm just saying that it appears like I can't debate the generality of this bill. Here who talking? There are two in here that remains in here that made more challenges of the chair than anyone else. Mr. Speaker, I see where this is going. Before I get, because the Premier is sitting there under his breath. No, you're not trying to help me, trying to encourage you to use your powers of the chair. That's what he's doing. But I got to call everybody out. That's how we got to work, okay? It is also my understanding, in my 17 plus years, that the government will have its say, its way, but the opposition must have its say. And at all times, the minority must be protected. That is a tenet of democracy. Because while the government has the majority, and that may reflect in the majority of the populace, the members on this side also represent a sector of society which needs representation. Mr. Speaker, I yield.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, does the mover wish to exercise his right of reply?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his very helpful contribution. And just to clarify that, as far as this bill is concerned, we're not changing the definition of young person throughout the youth justice law. We're just changing it for the purpose of Section 28 to allow those persons who fall between 17 and 18 who were not caught by the adults caution law to be able to also be eligible for caution. But the definition of young persons under the youth justice law remains the same in all other respects. That's all this bill is seeking to do. So it's not a whole-scale change. Having said that, I also take on board his observation about us taking a more holistic look at the challenges that face young people. I think is a genuine concern, and it is certainly our contemplation that going forward we will have that sort of a dialogue, Mr. Speaker. We know there are a lot of at-risk youngsters around, and government has been doing things over the years to try and address that. And we pledge to continue in that vein. So I certainly Thank you for that observation as well, those observations, and it's something that we certainly wish to take on board going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Spend conviction law? Yeah.
But the portion says it's expunged after 3 years.
Right. But as far as these, well, I mean, we're looking at a narrow window here. We're looking at somewhere between 14 and 17, 18. After these people become 18, then certainly this is not recorded as a conviction or a caution. This falls away. They now progress to becoming adults and fall to be dealt with under this other law.
But there's nothing that says that if it once you went away 18, that can be brought back up.
Yeah, but
On sentence.
no, the section, if you, sorry, Mr. Speaker. If you look at the section 28.5, it says if a young person who has received a caution is convicted of an offense. So this section is relevant as long as you remain a young person. That's all it does. That's all it does. So I think,
That's 14, by 18 it can still be running.
right. But after 18, it doesn't apply. No?
Adults can get it by 23.
Yeah.
Members, if there is any doubt, then we go into committee. Members have an opportunity to ask questions and go back and forth and offer amendments which this chair will accept if the government agrees. But we can't have this cross debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank members for their support. Thank you.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Youth Justice Amendment Bill 2018 be given a second reading. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The Youth Justice Amendment Bill 2018 is given a second reading.
The Trade and Business Licensing Amendment Bill 2018.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time and is set down for a second reading. It's a second reading now. The Honorable Minister for Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill for a law to amend the trade and business licensing law to simplify the application procedure, to exempt Caymanians from an aspect of the application procedure, to empower the board to enter into arrangements with relevant public authorities to facilitate the direct receipt of information and for incidental and connected purposes.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the mover wish to speak thereto? Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the law to simplify the application procedure for obtaining a trade and business license. The intent is to address the challenges and collective concerns expressed by the business sector and remove some of the unnecessary requirements expected of applicants. It also seeks to exempt Caymanians from certain aspects of the application procedure and empowers the Trade and Business Licensing Board to liaison with relevant public authorities to facilitate the direct receipt of information. Mr. Speaker, this bill is arranged into 4 clauses. Clause 1 seeks to provide for the short title and commencement of the legislation. Clause 2 seeks to amend the principal law to provide that a reference or a current utility bill is required from an applicant who is not Caymanian. The provision also seeks to amend the principal law to exempt Caymanians from the requirement to provide a police clearance certificate when submitting an application for a license under the law, except where the application is for a license in a sector for which the board determines that a police clearance certificate is required. Clause 2 also seeks to amend the law to provide that where an applicant is a company, it may provide the required company documents, or it may permit the board to receive the information directly from the relevant registry. Similarly, an applicant who is required to provide a police clearance certificate may provide the certificate or permit the board to receive the information directly from the relevant registry of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, Clause 2 seeks to amend the principal law by providing that the board may enter into an arrangement, understanding, or agreement with any public authority to facilitate the electronic or other receipt of the information required under Section 18(2)(e). By way of the exemptions and the options for the board to receive the information electronically, the provisions in Clause 2 aim to make the application procedure more streamlined and manageable. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 seeks to amend the principal law to provide that a license shall not be renewed where the applicant is not in compliance with this law and laws relating to employees' pensions, employee health insurance, and labor relations. Clause 3 removes the requirement for the first-time applicants for licenses to be compliant with employee pensions, employee health insurance, and labor relations at the point of application for the license. Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 seeks to amend the principal law to remove the requirements to publish by order any conditions or restrictions that are attached to licenses by the board. The provision states that the board may attach conditions or restrictions as it considers fit in the interest of, amongst other things, public safety and health. Honorable Speaker, these changes to the current law are intended to create a more business-friendly environment that supports business development and entrepreneurship and serves to help rather than hinder growth and success within this most important segment of our economic community. Recognizing the business sector contribution as drivers of economic growth and job creation, one of the centerpieces of this, as well as the previous administration's strategic focus, has been to put policies and reforms in place to streamline and improve the business process experience. Programs and initiatives designed to assist in unlocking the true potential of commerce in this country have been implemented during the term of the last administration through to the present time, resulting in tangible benefits and improvements being realized by business owners. One such example, Mr. Speaker, is the Micro and Small Business Incentive Program, which government first introduced in August of 2014, which has now been renewed for a further 2 years. This program reduced the cost of doing business by significantly lowering and, in some instances, eliminating the trade and business license fees for qualifying micro and small businesses. Mr. Speaker, this initiative helped Caymanians start more than 1,000 new small businesses, which effectively doubled the number of business licenses granted compared to the preceding year. The resultant economic growth helped to renew investor confidence and served as a catalyst for more development, more opportunities, and further expansions of large and small businesses alike. Mr. Speaker, in 2014, 573 new businesses applied under this program. 524 of those were grants. In 2015, 1,754 applied, and 1,343 of these were grants. In 2016, Mr. Speaker, we had 3,529 businesses apply under the incentive. 978 of these were grants. And in 2017, Mr. Speaker, 4,196 businesses applied under this incentive, and 1,254 of these were grants. Mr. Speaker, as we could see by the number of renewals that this incentive has been working, and that the small businesses are thriving in this economy. The Ministry's support of programs like this stems from the recognition that small business are the lifeblood of our domestic economy, Mr. Speaker, and their collective contributions are vital to the economic health and prosperity of this country. Given that more businesses and commercial activity translate into more jobs for our people, government has remained steadfast in its commitment to take bigger and bolder steps to facilitate development of a simple, stable, and effective business environment. Mr. Speaker, this unity government made a commitment to provide more support to small and micro businesses, as well as to do more to assist Caymanians wishing to start and grow their own businesses. In fact, it was pledged that 25% of the regulations that hinder small business would be abolished within the first 18 months of assuming office. While these continue to be key priority areas for government, I am pleased to affirm in this honorable House that the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, on behalf of the government, is delivering on that pledge. Tremendous strides are being made to strengthen essential processes and eliminate unnecessary barriers in an effort to positively impact the business experience and cost of doing business across the board, but particularly for small and micro-sized businesses. Mr. Speaker, in order to reduce the effort required by businesses to obtain their trade and business licenses, an interagency team began streamlining the application process and amending relevant legislation in order to eliminate unnecessary paperwork. The project is being completed in phases and in conjunction with the new online application system for use by the Department of Commerce and Investment. Phase 1, Mr. Speaker, was completed in January of 2018, this year, and removed the following requirements from the application process: the need for a cover letter, a business plan, strata approval, character reference, and we have replaced the lease agreement with a letter of intent. By amending the current law, and regulations, Mr. Speaker, we've streamlined the trade and business license application process. Government will achieve an average reduction overall of 50% in terms of the requirements and red tape which sole traders and registered companies will need to traverse in order to obtain a trade and business license. Efforts are also underway, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate the submission of applications and renewals online as part of the wider e-government initiative, which is anticipated to be launched by June 1st of 2018. It is anticipated that these amendments will go a long way in supporting business creation, development, and expansion, and will ultimately improve the odds of success for commercial enterprises of all sizes, particularly the small and micro size, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I greatly appreciate the government's ongoing commitment to this sector, coupled with the willingness to not only continue the positive momentum, but to take it several steps further in order to stimulate growth opportunities to allow businesses to take their enterprise to the next level, Mr. Speaker. As a consequence, my ministry continues to work hard to introduce a wide range of initiatives, which, if you will allow me, I'll speak to briefly. Mr. Speaker, one of the strategic broad outcomes outlined in government's most recent strategic policy statement is to improve the avenue through which advice and support is made available to entrepreneurs wanting to start or grow a small business. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report my ministry is working with key stakeholders on setting up a small business development center, commonly referred to as an SBDC, to boost the level of support delivered to this segment of the business community. Proposed services to be offered through the development center includes professional business counseling, technical training and assistance, with gaining access to funding. These services are intended to be long-term, relationship-based, and involve programs of development which are anticipated to feed directly into economic growth. Mr. Speaker, it is intended that the services provided by the SBDC will complement existing business support services which are provided by the Chamber of Commerce and the Cayman Islands Small Business Association. The ministry will be working closely with those industry partners and other relevant stakeholders to take this plan forward. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to take a moment to publicly thank my ministerial colleagues who, without hesitation, agreed to provide funding in the budget to allow us to examine ways to set up a comprehensive one-stop shop that will promote and cater to the interests of this sector. Mr. Speaker, the ministry has also been examining the possibilities for the recreation of a National Investment Bureau with a view to encourage overseas and local investments into the Cayman Islands. The Investment Bureau is envisioned as being a one-stop shop, Mr. Speaker, for investors wishing to do business in the Cayman Islands, and it is proposed that the Bureau will offer investment facilitation, meet and greet services, and investment brochures and booklets. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, to drive inward investment and represent our interest abroad, the ministry will be exploring the possibilities of attending trade shows and conferences in key locations. It is anticipated that the Bureau will provide an avenue through which to positively promote the Cayman Islands to overseas governments, individuals, organizations, and the media. Over time, this will enhance our island's reputation in the global arena and will augment existing efforts to attract inward investment to our shores. Mr. Speaker, turning our attention now to the youth, I'm very keen to ensure that opportunities exist that will allow younger persons in our community to pursue their dreams of becoming entrepreneurs or independent wage earners. To promote this initiative and to strengthen relations between the students and the businesses, my ministry continues to work with the University College of the Cayman Islands on the UCCI Student Consulting Program. Mr. Speaker, this program is a joint partnership between the Ministry of Commerce, the University College of the Cayman Islands, and Cayman National Bank. This year marks the highest student and business participation rate, with a total of 19 students and 7 small businesses. It is also the first year that some of the small businesses have been owned by teenage alumni of UCCI. Supporting the creation and development of small business is one of the most important priorities for my ministry, And this youth program, geared towards the next generation of business owners, is another example of the steps being taken to encourage and develop business and opportunities at every level, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, broadly speaking, the initiatives I have highlighted illustrate that government is taking action on a number of fronts to facilitate sustainable, productive, and inclusive growth within the business and commercial sectors.
Honorable Minister, Honorable Premier, Standing Order 10-2, suspension thereof.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
The question is that Standing Order 10-2 be suspended to enable the business of the House to continue beyond the hour of 4:30. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. The House will continue till we finish.
Thank you, Mr.
Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, broadly speaking, the initiatives I have highlighted illustrate that government is taking action on a number of fronts to facilitate sustainable, productive, and inclusive growth within the business and commercial sectors. While these may sound like convenient and catchphrases, Mr. Speaker, they are in fact the principles which guide our focus and decision-making on a daily basis. All businesses operating in the country play an important role as employers and contributors to our economy. As Minister of Commerce, I am proud to say that our business sector is motivated, innovative, and entrepreneurial, and it is against this backdrop that the government and my ministry are pragmatically and progressively doing everything possible to support and promote this sector. The ministry will continue to support the efforts of the Chamber of Commerce and the Cayman Islands Small Business Association and maintain dialogue to further strengthen the close collaborative business relationship that currently exists between the ministry and these key stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, the ministry has been listening to the collective concerns expressed by the business sector, and this bill seeks to amend the law to address these challenges and remove some of the unnecessary requirements expected of applicants. Mr. Speaker, it also seeks to exempt Caymanians from certain aspects of the application procedure and empowers the Trade and Business Licensing Board to liaison with relevant public authorities to facilitate and direct receipt of information, to facilitate the direct receipt of information. Mr. Speaker, we have a number of recommendations that arose during the 21-day consulting period. These amendments will be addressed in the Committee on Bills as appropriate. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I want to thank this honorable House and its members for their assistance over the last few months in providing information and support that we could get to this point. And so I therefore commend the Trade and Business License Amendment Bill 2018 to this honorable House for members for passage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Northside, the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition generally supports anything that can be done to improve the trade and business license in Cayman. However, Mr. Speaker, we do have some concerns, and while I listened attentively to the Minister of Commerce lauding the success of the bill, one wonders why he now needs to amend the bill if it's doing such a good job in getting all these new businesses up and coming. But, Mr. Speaker, that leads me to the fact that I believe it is time in this country to have some kind of fair trade fair competition legislation coupled with some kind of a certificate of need. Because the question I have for the Minister of Commerce is how many of those 1,000 business licenses that were given out, the businesses are still in existence today, 4 or 5 years later. Many of them, Mr. Speaker, I would hazard a guess, even if they exist, are not doing so well. Because without some kind of certificate of need and some kind of fair trade competition act, how many judicial loans can this country accommodate? Many of these small businesses that have been granted these new licenses are simply reducing the opportunity for existing license to make any money or to even break even, because they're providing the exact same service to the exact same clientele. And the opposition, Mr. Speaker, does not support the idea proposed by the Chamber of Commerce that we need to grow the population of this country in some short period of time to 100,000 people simply to provide customers for the businesses who have obtained license. Because I can very well recall, Mr. Speaker, in the 90s when we had a downturn in the economy, the solution by these same people at that time, when we had between 30 and 35,000 people, was that we needed 60,000 people. That would solve the economic problems of the government and the country. Well, Mr. Speaker, today we have the 60,000 people. What do we have? More crime, more social ills, more Caymanians are in debt beyond their means, more people are losing their houses, more people are not getting jobs. So growth that is not managed in some way is not always good for the country. And the other extreme, Mr. Speaker, is also becoming very prevalent in our world of commerce here, which is the non-competitive nature of conglomerates being created by super wealthy people in controlling large sectors of the economy. So, Mr. Speaker, while we agree with some of the changes in the bill, we have some concerns. It says in Clause 2A, 2A, evidence of status as a Caymanian, if any. We would wonder whether you're going to put it in the regulations or whether we put it in the law, what constitutes that demonstration or evidence of status as a Caymanian. Because that's a thing that is being thrown around the country now, that we Caymanians have to prove that we're Caymanian. Even though we can produce birth certificates that our parents were Caymanians, etc., that is not being accepted by certain aspects of the economy. We are not sure what is the purpose for an applicant who's not a Caymanian to produce utility services bills, whether that utility service bill is being used to demonstrate residence on the island, or what is the purpose of that person who may be the minority shareholder in the business, that is the 40%, having to produce a utility bill. We have some concerns that the legislation puts in place the requirement of the applicant to produce evidence of health insurance, evidence of pension, and that they comply with basically all the other laws in the country to get a business license. We're a little bit concerned of whether that is, because we already have legislation and boards and bodies who have the responsibility to regulate those industries. Are we conceding that they're not doing their job and therefore they need the assistance of the Trade and Business License Board to force people to comply because the regulatory agencies are not doing their job? We also concerned when it gets down to 2F, where it is said that the board may enter into any arrangement, understanding, or agreement with any government department or public authority to facilitate the electronic or other receipt of information under subsection 2E. Whether that refers to this information on health insurance and pension, and why is it not requiring the authorization of the applicant to get that information? We believe that it is important that the applicant have to give that authorization for the government to use that information against them. We're not sure why you need the par value of the shares in the company in order to get a business license. We believe that in clause 3, which amends section 19 of the principal law, under 1A, 1 capital A license shall not be renewed by the board where it is small a, is satisfied that any of the provisions under subsection 1A apply to the applicant for renewal, or B, and this is the section that we believe is a little bit broad, and you could get some unnecessary interference by the board itself, because it says the applicant is not compliant with the law or any other applicable law regarding the applicant, including laws relating to employee pensions, employee health insurance, and labor relations in the islands, and the applicant has not taken the necessary steps to resolve the non-compliance. Does this mean if I don't have a driver's license and I apply for a business license, the board can refuse my application? Does it mean that if I'm involved in a dispute with my health insurance company, with an employee dispute that has not been completely resolved, that the license can be denied? And we would like to see some kind of time frame opportunity given to the applicant for renewal if the board believes that they're not complying with a particular law that the board believes it should be compliant with. The applicant should be so informed and given a 30 or 60-day period rather than refuse a license to demonstrate compliance. We'd also like to see under 2D, every Caymanian applicant shall be exempt from the requirement under section 2C except where the application, which is the production of a police record, where the application is for a license or for a trade or business in a sector where the board determines that it is mandatory for every applicant to provide a police clearance certificate. We would prefer to see a schedule as part of the law of those sectors of the economy that the board could make that determination on, as opposed to leaving it up to the board to decide. Because a lot of these things that, for instance, if one of the things that the board might be concerned about is person applying for a business license to operate a school, whether the person has a police record, but the person has to get a license from the education department, which makes a judgment as to the competence of the professional and the social, moral, and ethical concerns about the person for that license. For the board then to say that in their determination, although they are subjected to that scrutiny by the other agency, and they have gotten that license, the board can then arbitrarily basically say, we think you should produce a police record. So we would like to see the law or the regulations develop a schedule of businesses or sectors of the economy for which the board could override the exemption in 2C, where the Caymanians do have to provide a police record. So, Mr. Speaker, if we can negotiate some of those changes during the committee stage, we can offer our support to the legislation.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give my conditional support to the bill. I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that the minister, in his attempts to fix the ministry upon which he's in charge of, should be credited, because I've had the opportunity to watch him try to effectively do the research necessary, talk to relevant stakeholders in the industry, and effectively brought new changes to this parliament, and hear him speak about it and follow through with his hopes with the business community, and in particular the small business community. So I commend him on that, and I intend to give the support to this particular bill. But I think that there's some parts, before I say that, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to see that the minister now in charge has recognized that there has been some failures on previous legislation and have been willing to make the adjustments. I think that there still needs to be more adjustments that are necessary. And I hope that I can get to explain those right now in respect to my contributions. Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, over the last 8 months, I've had a number of small businesses come to me about the new regulations and how difficult it has been for them. And those mainly are persons who are cooks. We all know that, particularly in Georgetown, we have a lot of cooks in our area, and a lot of bakers as well. And since the new trade and business license requirements came into play, it's been created much difficulty for them to comply because of the requirements of them working from home and having to meet the same requirements of an industrial kitchen for a restaurant. And I've heard the minister speak about his efforts to help small businesses and entrepreneurs. There have been many small businesses and entrepreneurs across the island for many years, and they never go much farther than that. That's their little niche market. They don't do much more than a little order here and there. But some of these regulations are putting them at a place where they have to become like a major restaurant. And most of these types of individuals who do those kinds of things cannot afford what some other business owners can do in respect to making the amendments, say for instance in these industrial kitchens, an industrial stove, sinks and like. And I know that most of these requirements on these small businesses are from a safety and health perspective. But I've had the opportunity to examine some of them, and I think that there could be a re-examination of that balance. And I'll give you, for example, Mr. Speaker, any person who is applying for a trade and business license to be a cook has to now have an industrial stove with a hood roof for the purposes of what they call the gas trap or the oil trap, because of cooking oil fires. For cooking oil fires being a safety hazard. Now, in discussing this, these persons, the amounts of services they provide to their community, because they're so small, is no different than, say, for instance, a large family of, say, 7 Caymanians in a home who cook up a big old Sunday dinner. So unless these requirements are suggesting that a Cayman family that has 7 or 8 people in the house cooking on a regular stove has to get those same safety requirements, these requirements on these small business home cooks at home makes no sense. And it's making it rather difficult for them to operate because they do not want to be illegally operating in the Cayman Islands. So I think there needs to be a re-examination of that middle ground, particularly for many of those seniors and small entrepreneurs, particularly bakers. We don't see a lot of major baking companies, and every time you see one pop up, within a year from now, you hear they go out of business because they simply cannot operate on the basis of the requirements on a large scale. We don't have the population for it. And one of the things that I've heard by way of feedback, and I'm not sure of the protocols, Mr. Speaker, but I actually have a petition here that was sent to me up to this morning, knowing that this bill was going to be drafted. And I had the intention to speak to the minister about it. And I'm going to give him respect to speak to him afterwards. But basically, I have a number of people who are cooks who are concerned about this and think that there can be a middle ground found in respect to these requirements because they're just too steep and they're very costly. And by all means, they want to meet these requirements, but they simply can't from a cost perspective. And Mr. Speaker, what even makes this worse is because of the high cost of living in the Cayman Islands, many of these persons have this as a part-time job. They have a main job, and they'll use their weekends to cook a little food or cook some extra cakes for special events and what have you. And they say, you know what? So you can simply go get a business license and be operational because I don't want to do this illegal. But when you go sign up for that, you end up having to pay about $30,000 just to make the requirements to continue to do something that you make $100 off of or $200 off of on the weekend. And it makes no sense. And if we want to continue to support small businesses, the mom and pop shops, we have to find a middle ground. Even if that means, now, Mr. Speaker, in this argument, one of the other things that I had to say with my constituents is that I have to see things two ways. Because a person who wants to go big market and open a big shop, they have to meet these requirements. So why shouldn't you? So how do you find a balance? And Mr. Speaker, one of the things the government can do is to say, okay, if you are a small business of this size, you're not allowed to sell more than this amount of your products. To limit them so at least those who actually are going out there and spending the big money for the big requirements like the industrial kitchens and the like and renting a big shop and what have you, they can feel, well, okay, then they have a larger piece of the pie to shop from. So basically what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that there has to be a middle ground found because currently right now, for many cooks, at least in my constituency and the people who have come to me, they cannot survive under these requirements because they simply cannot. For one, the banks even not giving many Caymanians any loans anyhow, unless you have land already put up. And if you got land, you might as well end up selling that and using the money anyway rather than paying interest. So they're not giving many small business loans. And the minister has acknowledged that that's an area that needs to be worked on, and he's working on that. I've seen the efforts of him trying to negotiate with banks, so I give him credit for that. But even more so reason to find a middle ground for those persons who do cook from home. And I'm speaking about persons in my constituency who just cannot make it. And I'm hoping that the minister will take what I've said this evening and be willing to even have conference with myself and some of my constituents about these concerns, because I know that there's other options available to the government to investigate, because I know this government does not want to undermine those small business mom and pops, even though they want them to be compliant. We all want them to be compliant, but if that compliance is so far out, then you're going to have a lot of people still doing it illegally. When the government started on this notion of getting everybody paying pensions and license, and we're going to give them a cheap business license fees as well as even free for a period of time, if I remember correctly. Everybody was hopping down the road down to the trading business license to go do it, but didn't realize when they got there, the requirements, you had the hoops you had to go through just to get it would have cost you an arm and a leg, and that was already a person who didn't have any legs. So Mr. Speaker, though I support this minister because I've seen him work, I trust that he's competent, he's going to follow through with everything, but I am asking on behalf of the constituents of Georgetown Central and Georgetown and Grand Cayman and all the Cayman Islands, because I know there's many more cooks outside of my constituency as well. But there is that niche market that simply cannot survive on the requirements that put on them. And I know that there can be a middle ground that can be found that doesn't put so much a burden on them, even if that means limiting their possibilities of business opportunities. And I think there's some practical approaches that can be looked at in respect to the requirements because, and I speak from an informed position, I was an ex-fireman, and I know some of these requirements that they have in respect to the safety elements for a household kitchen or what you would have for an industrial kitchen at Cayman Bay. And I'm going to tell you straight, Mr. Speaker, the people from Georgetown Central, we don't live at Cayman Bay. We cannot afford, in most cases, Cayman Bay style life. And what it takes to cook a plate of oxtail or to bake a cassava cake might need an industrial stove or an industrial fridge or industrial oven to do all of that. And Miss Suzanne from next door doesn't mind paying a little $7 for the cassava cake that is made on a traditional old Cayman caboose. Does that mean that that Caymanian can no longer operate a business around here? What if my grandmother was alive today and she said she wanted to cook on a caboose? Are these requirements stopping her from operating a business? We're not being practical. We're not finding the middle ground. I say that, but I am confident that the minister is going to find that middle ground that is necessary for them to still operate. And here's the worrying part, Mr. Speaker. I was getting to the point of the cost of living. Many of these people have a full-time job, and that full-time job still does not give them enough income to survive, so they are forced to do something they grew up knowing to do. Everybody, if you think about it, Mr. Speaker, this is probably one skill that you get for free is knowing how to cook. Okay? Everybody needs to eat. So they use that one skill that they know. Boy, everybody loved your potato salad or your cassava cake or your oxtail or barbecue chicken. And they say, you know what, I can make an extra few bucks here. So they use those extra little skill sets that they have to make up for the losses. Maybe an extra $400 can carry them through to make them maintain. Without that $400, they may find themselves easily in foreclosure within 1 year. And what I'm concerned about, Mr. Speaker, is that if there's not a middle ground found for those individuals who simply just cannot, one, either get a loan, two, don't have enough savings themselves to meet these high demands in respect to requirements, when truly speaking, they don't need to go that far to operate the small business approach that they're having. Something that we know is culturally our norm to do, to eat from your next door neighbor's kitchen. And if we don't do that, we may affect a large amount of small Caymanians who are depending on that for survival purposes. I'm not talking about just extra income to go in your savings. I'm talking about that extra $400, $500 that they make per month to make sure that they're staying afloat. So I hope that the minister takes my contribution into context of this bill and maybe give a commitment to this honorable House, hopefully, to examine this area. And if he needs persons to discuss this with who actually practically go through it themselves, I'm happy to provide them to him. And I will be presenting him with this petition from some of them already after this debate. But those are my only concerns, and I just wish the minister well. I know that he will do what he can in respect to what he's available to do. But those are my contributions, and I hope they are taken into account. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? A member from East End?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't allow this opportunity to pass. I am happy to see that the government has seen the error of their ways. Mr. Speaker, you pointed that out to them in 2014, that what they were doing were wrong. And it was going to stifle Caymanians. The Hanseards will bear me out, sir. But I am glad that the minister responsible, who was part of the government that put it in place, has now come and corrected what that former minister put in place. Albeit a little late. However, sometimes some of us are late in coming to God and seeing our things, but the people of New Orleans wasn't. They knew they had to correct the mistake they had made 4 years prior to that. So everybody gets their due reward. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the new minister is now doing what should have been done then. But they all complicit in it, you know. They voted for it. I didn't. I voted no. Mr. Speaker, I don't know where that disappeared to now. Mr. Speaker, in research for this bill, I went and researched the Hanseards. And there were some very interesting comments made by your good self and the not so good minister who brought it. Mr. Speaker, in particular, page 726 of the Hanseards of Thursday, the 27th of November, 2014. The Honorable G. Wayne Patton says, Madam Speaker, these recommendations, which are reflected, that is from the Chamber of Commerce and the board that they had set up, which are reflected in this bill, are intended to improve the ease with which businesses can be licensed by allowing for more streamlined operations of the board and department and greater efficiencies. The proposed provisions also have an emphasis on creating a business environment in which there are clear rules to follow, and where there are breaches of these rules, swift action can be taken to enforce them. This creates fairness across our business community, promotes proper competition, and allows businesses to succeed in the best possible environment. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to your contribution, in which you specifically.
Honorable member, I don't know that that would be helpful to the House and to the debate.
It's helpful, yeah. Mr. Speaker, when your contribution, and I ain't saying you were wrong, you were much more right than he was at that time. I have watched the legislation grow from small pieces here in the last 30 years to huge bill to get things done that I think should be quite easy to spell out. I'm not here crying down the legal department. I know how hard they work to get the aims and objectives of the government, sometimes so convoluted that you can't understand. I don't know how the legal minds themselves can understand, because what happens is that as politicians are being elected, we are trying to please everybody. So when the draft goes to the request for legislation, half of it doesn't tell the story. And the facts that bear that out is when you bring a piece of legislation here, you get as many amendments to it as the bill itself, trying to please everybody, and it becomes so convoluted you can't understand it when it's all done. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I understand my good friend, the Minister for Commerce, and I wrote this down, and he may get up on the point of clarity if he so chooses. He said, as I understand it, that these amendments will reduce 50% of the red tape that was created by that same law in 2014. Mr. Speaker, I applaud him, but there's much more to be done. Much more. Mr. Speaker, the law, a couple of things that I want to specifically talk about. In particular, this thing about police record. Mr. Speaker, the question I have is, what are you going to do with it? The first rule of management is don't collect information you don't need. Are we saying that we're talking about helping Caymanians encouraging them to become entrepreneurs, but if they got a little police record, you got to turn it down? I hope that's not what it means. Because I am convinced that's what it means, because Section 4, which amends Section 21 of the law, says the board may attach such conditions or restrictions on licenses generally or to licenses granted to a sector or an industry as it considers fit in the interest of public safety, public order, public health, or otherwise in the public interest. And we're really making the board do all that? Mr. Minister, that is so subjective that anyone could be in a position that it turned down the opportunity to own a license. Now, when I was much younger, Mr. Speaker, my dad owned a business, and of course in them days, that's in the 60s, there was no, my father didn't have a business license, but he had a trucking business. Then, when I came along, my three brothers and I, the rule of thumb in business is go into what you know. And we knew that business. So we went to do a business license. And it was a right at that time. What the business trade and business license did in 2014 turned it into a privilege for Caymanians to get a license. And you had to crawl to the authorities to do so. I applaud the minister for cutting it by 50% or so he says, and I hope it does. Mr. Speaker, elsewhere in this world, more particular, elsewhere in the Caribbean, you know what happens? Businesses under $1 million gross are given everything free because they're recognized as small businesses. For your citizens' economy. Barbados, it's so. There are other countries it is so. I can't say $1 million in this country, Mr. Speaker. It might be 500,000, depending. But we apply, the minister talks about the initiatives with small business and micro business and that kind of stuff. If you want to get if you want to get the incentives, you got to put in your business plan. Really? That's what we have become. Mr. Speaker, you were right. You used in your contribution at that time, you said smothering the people. We need, anyway, Mr. Speaker, I've had occasion now, recently, to reapply for one old license that I had eons ago. What did the young man Ryan say to me when I inquired? And I'm not trying to bash him or anything, but he gave me one lot of things that I had to do that I ran out one whole pen out of ink. And you know I don't like the press buy the ink by the barrels. So I had to go borrow a pen. Mr. Speaker, we asked for police records. We're still asking for renewals to provide evidence that you're compliant with a number of regulatory bodies. And I brought this to that young man's attention. Of course, he said, oh, we're trying to do it, Mr. McLean. So here we are asking to be compliant with pensions, insurance, labor disputes, and the like, to get a business license renewed. Now we're changing it to renewal only, because grant, you're starting up. Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring to the attention of my colleagues in this honorable House the fact that when you are licensed in this country, by a regulatory body, you have to provide it to them. Why are we taking the responsibility of one body and putting it on the other? Mr. Speaker, there is health insurance that is mandatory. The Health Insurance Commission must ensure that it's enforced. And if it is not enforced, they must notify all and sundry that it is not. And that prompts something else. Pensions is mandatory. Let's look at the Builders' Law that the minister is now feverishly working on to get some thing done with the builders.
Did you say builder's law?
Builders, yeah.
And you're going to relate that to this?
Of course. Mr. Speaker, the Builders' Law, Mr. Speaker, you understand, to get a license in the Builders' Law, you are required to have a trade and business license. Nevertheless, the lawyers who are governed by another law is not required to get it. But the builders are going to be required to have a trade and business license. You see who getting hurt? Mr. Speaker, the Builders' Law requires an applicant to, subject to the other provisions of this section, a business entity shall, on application made to the board in the prescribed manner and on payment of the prescribed fee, be entitled, subject to regulation made under Section 42G, to be registered if the entity satisfies the other requirements for registration under this part, but the board may refuse to register an entity if A, the superintendent of health insurance appointed on the Health Insurance Commission, Law 2003, informs the board in writing or on his own initiative or upon inquiry by the board, which power and duty are hereby conferred, that the business entity concerned is not up to date with the health insurance contribution. And that goes on for labor, pension, and public liability insurance. So the regulatory bodies have it enshrined in their law, and now we're putting it in the trade and business license. Well, we got it in there. We always did. Eh? Taking it out. So tell me, upon renewal, upon application, no, but upon renewal, it's still in there. That's what it says, as far as I can read. I'm not saying now that. Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, this is Section 3 under Section 19. Upon renewal, you don't have to, upon grant, you don't have to provide it. But upon renewal, you must. Then, Mr. Speaker, we look at the education law. Well, the regulations, really. The education law makes provisions for anyone who wants to start educational institutions. And they too require you to comply with a clean police record. So it bothers me why we would be taking the responsibility from one regulatory body and throwing it on to the other. The fact that you get a business license doesn't mean you're going to be able to operate in the field that you want to operate in. The due diligence must be done by that regulatory body. So I find it, I've always found it the Education Council shall register an educational institution or institution providing educational support services if in relation to an application the Council is satisfied that there is compliance with the following minimum requirements. The applicant is 18 years of age or over, where the applicant is an individual. The applicant has not been convicted in the islands or outside the islands of an offense which renders the person unsuitable to be associated with an educational institution or institution providing educational support services. Where the applicant is accompanied, none of its directors or in the case of another body of person, none of its members have been convicted in the islands or outside the islands of an offense referred to in paragraph B. Where a person is to be employed by the applicant or engaged, whether or not for payment, in the operation of the institution, the person has not been convicted of an offense referred to in subparagraph 3B, and the premises in which an educational institution or institution providing educational services, support services is to be operated meets the requirements set out in these regulations, in any law, and in the ministry policies and guidelines. So, Mr. Speaker, that tells me you can get a business license, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to pass the hurdle to be in the education field. That's all it tells me, because the education department is required to do that. And I want to point that out to say every regulatory body in this country has its own requirements, and the due diligence has to be done there. There is no need to throw it on the Trade and Business License Board. It is a right, once you have proven you are Caymanian, to be able to do a trade and business license. It must remain a right. So you're telling me a young man coming out of prison wants to do whatever, let's say gardening, and he wants to be legit, or maybe someone is trying to help him and they go and do a business, say, you know, I'm not helping you unless we go and do a trade and business license. And because the board thinks that that's not the place for him to be, the board can subjectively stop him? Oh, come on. I find that so, Mr. Speaker, in your words in 2014, so convoluted. Or someone said to me a few days ago that the police in this country seems to think that their job is to prosecute. And that's precisely what all these laws are about. Stop at all cost. Let us think, Mr. Speaker, I understand we need to ensure that things are up and straight and between the white lines and never cross the yellow lines. I understand all that. But why are we duplicating the services and making government more inefficient? That's why the pension board has, and the insurance commission has the authority to enter your premises to see if you're compliant. The law specifically says that. And the Attorney General can tell me if I'm wrong. Everybody have their regulatory body, but instead of them doing it, they use the body that is an absolute requirement to have your trade and business license, because the people out there are going to ask you if you to display it. But we're using the trade and business license to do the job that should have been done 6 months ago. And shut them down when they're not got the insurance or their pension being paid. That's how government works. So what's the purpose of the insurance and the pension department? They sit down, twiddle their thumb, and wait for the trade and business, somebody to go and renew their trade and business license? Mr. Speaker, I welcome the minister to look at these little things that are I don't know, they're holding as much stats as he produced here today. If it was so good, up to 2017, 4,000, I believe, and 1,000 of them were grants, something of that nature. Well, if it's going so good, why change it? You have brought it to change it because it's convoluted and it's inefficient. So despite all them stats, there is still something wrong with this. I believe that we can take it that much further. I want to see us give more incentives for Caymanian businesses. Now I noticed the amendment to it, we're extending it to permanent residents and RERC. What the trade and business license needs to look for, and I see Mr. Ryan here, Mr. Speaker, are those people here of independent means, their status is retirees and the likes, who are in business. That's what we need to stop. But I don't know if the government hasn't given them LCCL, though. That's the other part of it we need to look at. Because I see the newspaper has one applying for a quarry. And as I understand it, that individual came here as a retiree of independent means. I don't know what kind of license he has now. A good friend of mine the other day was doing a project and he decided not to go on with it. And someone approached him about selling the rights to the drawings and the planning permission. Who was this gentleman? He was acting on behalf of someone else. What was his status here? Residency with the right to work as a waiter in restaurants. Okay? That's what we need to be looking out for. But he is a realtor too. And he is soliciting financiers or developers and he is their head man. So he getting a big commission out of that too. But he also will be holding waiters on the hand. Mr. Speaker, that's what we need to look out for. Because what that is doing is usurping the very objective of Caymanians succeeding. And I understand that this other one that I was talking about, all these little guys bring in fish to trade. And he's doing his big thing too. I'll talk to you about that, Mr. Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, again, let me applaud the minister, because when I met with the minister early in his tenure, that was one of the subjects that we discussed. And he said he was going to try and do it as quickly as possible. And he recognized then that it wasn't creating a business-friendly environment. I hope his wish comes true, that this go a long way in reducing some of the red tape, some of the other stuff that was put in there that has Caymanians place the noose around their necks. The only thing left to do was to push them off the stool, because the rope was hooked up to the nearest grape tree and almond tree. And I can't blame like you, Mr. Speaker, when you said you can't blame the drafters. They do what they're asked to do. I'm sure in many instances they make recommendations like they used to make to me, that is not conducive with this or with that or whatever. But we know what the previous 4 years gave us. Hopefully this minister can correct it all. But then people in Newlands did a job for him. Mr. Speaker, I don't know why, my good friend in the northeast corner tell me to back off. I gotta follow whatever he tells me to do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you smiling, I better follow what he said. He's a senior man. Mr. Speaker, I encourage the minister to go and go a little further. I also encourage him to take that provision out of here about renewals, that you got to be compliant with pension and all that. That needs to come out, because pension has a responsibility. So does the insurance. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, does the minister wish to exercise his right of reply?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought I was bringing good news, but I am just as baffled as the young premier in the Youth Parliament on Monday. I obviously brought one bill, and everybody else is looking at another. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his constructive input. The bill was intended to address some of the red tape that businesses, in particular small businesses, were facing, Caymanian businesses were facing, and not to address fair trade or consumer protection or any of those sorts. We will be having a comprehensive review of the trade and business license law, and we do have plans and we do have some funding in place to start the groundwork on fair trade and consumer protection. But this bill was to deal with the red tape and to make the process is easier for small businesses in particular, but businesses in the Cayman Islands to operate. The requirement, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, spoke about the need for applicants or non-Caymanian applicants to produce utility service bills. Mr. Speaker, that is simply there, for some of the anti-money laundering requirements as far as knowing your customer, and to ensure that whilst we can confirm that our Caymanians are real people, that this foreign partner, this non-Caymanian individual, is actually a real person, and we have that information on them, where their domicile, etc. Both the Leader of the Opposition and the member from East End spoke about the provisions for pension and insurance. And Mr. Speaker, in section 2C, where the applicant will be carrying on a business in a public place, evidence of the approval of the relevant authority to carry on business in such a place, if applicable, evidence of compliance with the law relating to employee pensions or employee health insurance in force in the Cayman Islands where application is for renewal. Mr. Speaker, if you go to 2E, it says that an applicant may provide the information required under subsection 2A, B, and C with the application, or may permit the board to receive the information directly from the relevant registry maintained by a government or a public authority. So it's a self-certification opportunity there, Mr. Speaker, where the person just simply ticks a box on the form, allowing the Trade and Business License Board to ensure that they are in compliance with the relevant authorities. Mr. Speaker, police records, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition spoke about the need for police records in certain professions, and he gave an example of a school, and I agree with him in that one. But there are also the applications for a babysitting service, which wouldn't be registered or licensed under the education law. And so the board felt that in some circumstances, they may want to require a police record depending on the services being offered. I will take the Honorable Leader of the Opposition's suggestion on a schedule, and I will discuss that with the team, and perhaps that is one way to address that issue. Mr. Speaker, the member from East End, sorry, Mr. Speaker, and there are a few other suggestions made by the Honorable Leader of the Opposition that we will certainly take into consideration and discuss with him before the committee stage amendments. But Mr. Speaker, the Honorable member from East End commented on my reading of the statistics about the reduction of 50% of the requirements. And he said in this amendment, I will say I didn't rise to correct the member at that time, but I said by amending the current law and regulations and streamlining the trade and business licenses application process. That was referring to the items that I read out that were covered in phase 1, which were enacted in January of this year, which included the removal of the need for cover letter, the removal of a need for business plan, because you also repeated that, saying that we need a business plan. We removed that. We didn't need legislation to remove those. Removal of strata approvals, removal of the character references, and we've replaced the lease agreement with a letter of intent, in particular when it's a new application, because quite often you need a trade and business license to get your bank account before you can even enter into a lease. So I said that amending the current law and regulations and streamlining the trade and business license application process, the government will achieve an average reduction overall of 50%, not just from these. Absolutely. Yes. Mr. Speaker, the member also, I think when the member referred to a lot of the requirements that I covered in the initial stage in the January rollout of phase 1. We also have gotten past the idea that you have to go out and provide pension and insurance again. I reiterate, this is a self-certification where you simply tick a box. And now that we have access to, or online access to the general registry, some of this information we can provide, or we can have provided to us without having to put the applicant through the process of going in, standing in one line, waiting 30, 40 minutes to get one piece of paper to move over 2 feet to standing another line to put in the application. We now have the ability to move that information internally. Mr. Speaker, I think overall I've demonstrated here today that the process, I feel, and perhaps when the honourable member from East End goes to do his renewal, he won't have to carry any pens whatsoever and can actually do it online, and it'll take him 5 or 10 minutes. So, so I feel confident in saying that we will alleviate some of the members' fears as to the amount of requirements or the amount of writing or paperwork that he has to do in order to renew his trade and business license. Mr. Speaker, the member from Georgetown Central The member from Georgetown Central, Mr. Speaker, brought up the issue of small businesses, micro businesses, having difficulty in fulfilling the requirements which he believed are under this, and in particular the new trade and business regime. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, those requirements are requirements that fall under separate laws. And in fact, we have removed the need for you to produce those when applying for your trade and business license. But unfortunately, members of those authorities, namely Planning, Fire, Department of Environmental Health, either sit on the Trade and Business License Board or are notified whenever we issue a new trade and business license. And they are the ones that will enforce requirements for institutional kitchens or fire hoods or commercial equipment, grease traps, you name it, paved parking lots. Unfortunately, those don't fall under trade and business license. However, we have been speaking with the Chamber of Commerce and discussing, and I think we've potentially have at our first meetings of forming a multi-agency multi-agency board that will actually offer, for lack of a better description, an amnesty for the trade and business license regime. Whilst we have almost all but made it effortless to apply for trade and business license, and certainly in the micro and small businesses that the member from Georgetown Central spoke about, we've all but removed all fees except for the application fee. We recognize that if someone does come in for their trade and business license, that they will be exposed to other laws such as the planning law, Department of Environment, or the health law, and also fire. But what we're discussing with the Chamber of Commerce is assisting those persons in navigating the requirements under those different laws and departments. This is something that we can consult with them before they actually even put the application in to say, this is what's going to be expected for this type of business, and whether or not you fall under a cottage industry or you will require a full-blown trade and business license. Unfortunately, the trade and business license regime has no power over that. And as I said, you know, we have tried to make it easier even for those who are currently licensed that had to go out and run around and chase down these inspections and get this physical copy every time they had to renew or put in for a new trade and business license. We now put the onus on the different departments that they have to go out and do their own inspections and do their own due diligence. The other aspect that we're doing to address or to assist persons such as the ones that the member from Georgetown Central spoke about would be the Small Business Development Center when we get that up and running. As I explained earlier, the Small Business Development Center will be very much a relationship-based program where we will be able to assist some persons from going, even if they are going from a cottage industry of baking 1 or 2 cakes during the week to perhaps wanting to do a bit more. The Small Business Development Center will be a place where that person can come in and receive the guidance and help to navigate A, the regulatory authorities, B, setting up their business, the structure of the business, and hopefully further down the road, financing to help them grow. So whilst I cannot address it and we cannot help with the trade and business licensing regime, we do have other efforts, and we are making other efforts, namely in the partnership with the Chamber of Commerce on the amnesty program and also on the Small Development Center, which once up and running will be able to help persons navigate through those regulatory authorities. Mr. Speaker, one other comment was made both by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and by the member from East End about the success of the incentive programs that this government or the previous government put in place, and this government has renewed for the next 2 years. And I just wanted to go back through those numbers slowly for them. 573 applications were received in 2014. 524 of those were grants. So we had a few new companies apply under the scheme, some renewed under the scheme. In 2015, 1,754 applications came in under the scheme. 1,343 of these were grants, which means that we had 413 new applications. In 2016, 3,529 companies applied under the incentive program. 978 of these were grants, which means that we had a whopping 2,551 companies renew under the incentive program. And in 2017, we had 4,196 companies apply under the incentive program. 1,254 of these were grants, and Mr. Speaker, 2,942 were renewals under the scheme. That tells me clearly that the incentive program is working, and that at least after 4 years, 2,942 companies are still thriving under this economy and this government. Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I thank the members for their input, and I ask for their support in the passage of this bill. Thank you very much.
The question is that a bill entitled "A Bill for a Law to Amend the Trade and Business Licensing Law to Simplify the Application Procedure" well, let me read the short title, yes. The Trade and Business Licensing Amendment Bill 2018. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
The bill, the Trade and Business Licensing Amendment Bill 2018 has been given a second reading. Premier?
Mr. Speaker, may we have a division, please?
Division Clerk?
Honorable Alden McLaughlin.
Aye.
Honorable Moses Kirkconnell. Honorable Juliana O'Connor Connolly. Honorable Dwayne Seymour. Honorable Roy McTaggart.
Aye.
Honorable Joseph Hugh.
Aye.
Honorable Tara Rivers.
Aye.
Honorable Barney Bush. Captain Eugene Ebanks.
Aye.
Aye.
Miss Barbara Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. David White.
Aye.
Mr. Austin Harris.
Aye.
Honorable Ezra Miller. Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan. Mr. Anthony Eden.
Aye.
Madam Clerk,
You can vote. Mr. Christopher Saunders.
Yes.
Mr. Art McLean. You weren't here? Okay.
Results of the division, 15 ayes, 3 absentees, 3 absent. The House will now suspend until 7:15.